Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second panel of human rights implications of the digital gap and digital disruptions. Those of you who are feeling a bit lonely out in the crowd, I just wanted to say there's over 100 people online, so don't feel we're not a few of us only. So we're going to continue the discussion on human rights implications of the digital gap, and it's a incredibly huge problem. An estimated 3.6 billion people remain offline, just and with Africa being having the lowest internet usage rates, and in addition to the existing digital gap, intentional disruptions, which we'll be addressing by governments to access information and communication systems online, is a growing phenomenon. The effects of internet shutdowns, which are increasing by the day, run counter to the efforts to close the digital gap and have a negative impact on many human rights, including freedom of expression, access to information, and the right to vote. So what we want to address this afternoon is what steps have been taken by human rights mechanisms to act upon and bridge the digital divide? What are the human rights standards that should regulate internet shutdowns? What should be the role of international organizations, companies, and civil society to ensure universal internet access? And how can the human rights mechanisms work towards a more comprehensive approach on digitalization? We have an excellent group of speakers this afternoon, and I'll introduce them just before they speak. So the format I'm going to follow is each of the speakers will have 5 minutes opening statement. Then I'll ask a question, give each one 2 minutes, and then open it up to the floor, and we'll see how it goes. And I'm hoping also there'll be time for the panelists to ask each other questions. Always exciting. So I'm going to start off with Santiago Fiorio to my left. Santiago is the head of Human Rights and International Cooperation, Poverty Spotlight, where he's leading a technical assistance project for the implementation of multidimensional elimination of poverty programs in 14 countries. And recently, Santiago was elected to be a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. Congratulations. You'll start in January next year. Santiago holds a Master of Science in Human Rights from LSE, and his dissertation focused on, and I quote, the contribution of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for the promotion of international human rights standards. Santiago, you have 5 minutes. You'd like to go up there, right?
Yes, I will move to the podium.
Okay, please.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored to be here. I have moved here because I have some additional resources that I want to share with you. I am going to focus on the digital gap. My other colleagues are going to focus on digital disruptions. So my dissertation will go over there. So first of all, I would like to share with you some questions to think together when we have this discussion. First of all, should internet access become a human right? This is a question that's very important for me. And a subsequent question I want to leave you is, has internet access become a need for a dignified life? These questions are very important to think about what I'm going to show you. I have some additional data that I'm going to give you. I work in the implementation of a program that aims to eliminate multidimensional poverty. One of the indicators that we measure is the internet access. So this is data that we have collected from 47 countries, and we have the data of more than 90,000 families. It's not the 7.2 billion people living outside the world, but is where our program reaches. But I think that this data is very consistent what Miloon mentioned in the introduction. So I want to let you know that here the internet access for people who live in poverty, who are the ones that participate in our programs, they make the effort to try to get connection. So in spite they have many deprivations, they are still trying to remain in the green area of this chart. Then we have 33% of these people living with limited access. This means that they have maybe only just one member of the family has access to internet data, including maybe mobile data or home access, or even the quality of the connection is intermittent or very hard to reach. And the 9% means that there's no access at all, no devices, no connectivity. So this is what we consider to be an extreme poverty regarding internet access, which is not having access. But why do we have this affirmation? First of all, we have to understand that internet connection gives us many advantages for our well-being and to live the life that we want to live. Internet access can grant us entertainment, access to information, work, social interaction, sharing ideas, self-management, for example, access to banking services, calendars, emails, whatever we use every day. Actually, myself, I have to be honest with you. When I get up in the morning, the first thing I do is I check on my cell phone. And normally I have plenty of messages, but and I look at social media. I normally do this in the early morning. What is the first thing I do? Don't you do that? So how many of you have Instagram? How many of you use emails? And how many of you depend on those tools, specifically emails, to work, to generate resources, to live the life that you want to live? So internet access is, from my perspective, a need that justifies the existence of a right. So why do I have this thing? And I have additional arguments for this. First of all, there is an increasing demand, an increasing market for this, and internet access is today also an indicator of well-being. We are doing this at Poverty Stoplight, but also we have other examples. For example, University of Oxford has now created the International Multidimensional Index, which includes connectivity as one of the dimensions of multidimensional poverty. So this is another criteria that we should take into advance. Just before I finish, I know I am running out of time. At this moment, I understand that the issue of access to the internet is mostly being discussed within the Article 19 of the ICCPR. But I would like to bring the discussion to Article 2 of the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because internet is not only about civil and political rights, but it's overarching to economic, social, and cultural rights also. And one of my thoughts about this is that, as a general recommendation for mechanisms, is to consider the inclusion to the access of internet as a recognized right, to contribute to develop standards for its right by generating general comments or even general observations within treaty bodies, or even contribute with special procedures from the Human Rights Council, which are actively engaging in this new phenomena, which is the internet. Internet is new for us in this stage of human history. We should also, from my perspective, develop an access to internet human rights framework from the CESCR and from the CCPR, from the Human Rights Committee. I believe that those main international human rights law instruments are very useful to generate the framework on which to work an eventual right to access to the internet. Also, promote standards for governance within human rights standards in compliance with human rights law. That would be the last recommendation I would like to give, because we have all the advantages, but internet should also be regulated. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Santiago, and for your arguments making internet access as a human right. I think through the panel, we'll try to come to some ideas on how this can happen. You've given some suggestions. Perhaps there can be more. I want to move to Tim. Engelhardt is a human rights officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Geneva. His work focuses on the impacts of new and emerging technologies on the enjoyment of human rights, including the rights to freedom of opinion and expression and privacy. Prior to joining OHCHR, Tim worked at the World Intellectual Property Organization and in private legal practice, where he specialized in ICT-related matters. He's also the co-founder of the Humboldt Internet Law Clinic in Berlin. His training is as a German and US lawyer, and holds an LLM from Columbia Law School and a doctorate from Zurich University. Tim, please.
Hello, can you hear me well? Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks Santiago for passionate presentation. It was really setting the stage for us. Yeah, and I want to speak a little bit about recent work we've done in the office on internet shutdowns. So kind of the flip side, the denial of access where access would really be possible. And when we received this, the request from the Human Rights Council last year to write a report on the topic, we were actually quite excited because it gave us finally the opportunity to delve deeper into the issue and do some more systematic work and on a important stage and put it on the record within the UN system. And just to illustrate this scale of the problem, let me quote from something I read today in the Freedom on the Net report that got published today. They estimated that 51% of internet users live in countries where access to social media platforms was temporarily or permanently restricted. And 44% live in countries where authorities disconnected internet or mobile networks, often for political reasons. And here you can already see one important aspect of how we approach the issue. We don't look at shutdowns as, the traditional blanket shutdown of communications, but we include also the interference with major communications platforms, social media, etc. The variety of shutdowns, of types of shutdowns evolves, and measures taken become more and more sophisticated and in a way targeted in terms of duration, location, the throttling or downgrading of networks, etc. One major observation, we don't have the space to go through everything we did in the report, and Felicia is going to cover quite a lot of ground on the impacts of internet shutdown. So I really leave it very brief here. The political dimension of a large number of internet shutdowns is undeniable. It's almost half of all shutdowns between 2016 and 21 were carried out in the context of protests and political crisis. 225 shutdowns were recorded during public demonstrations. Shutdowns affected at least 52 elections between 2016 and 2021. And again, to give credit, we rely a lot on data collected by the amazing Keep It On Coalition. So thanks really for that work. The impacts on rights are vast, various political, civil and political rights, freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, of course, and as you rightly said, the impacts on social and economic rights, cultural rights are enormous. Education, health, and the provision of social services, all these are affected. Humanitarian aid is affected. The fact-finding mission on Myanmar a few years ago pointed to that quite vividly, and we've seen that play out many times. In our consultations for the report, one thing that really struck me is almost every time when we spoke to people affected by it, to civil society advocates, what came up all the time was it causes fear and panic. You know, people observe, oh, the internet is not working, and they can conclude something bad is going to happen or is already happening. So all in all, internet shutdowns are inherently at odds with proportionality, as we see it. And so in our report, we strongly recommend to refrain from any kinds of internet shutdowns. The question is, of course, what can be done? I would say, mostly thanks to tireless efforts by civil society activists around the world, there has been progress over the years, immense progress, I would say, in comparison to even 5 years ago. And looking alone what's been happening within the confines of the United Nations and the related bodies, you can see that. The Human Rights Committee very clearly spoke out about shutdowns, for example, in their general recommendations on the right to of peaceful assembly. Various special procedures mandate holders consistently for the last 5 to 10 years spoke out about shutdowns. Rapporteurs on freedom of expression, rapporteur on freedom of assembly and association. We've seen, I don't know anymore how many resolutions in the Human Rights Council that condemned internet disruptions. And of course, our office has been over the years consistent in calling out shutdowns in various statements of the High Commissioner and now in our recent report on internet shutdowns. All this led to additional momentum now in the larger United Nations. The Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation already addressed shutdowns. Now in our common agenda, shutdowns really got again the spotlight on them, and we are working within the United Nations now on taking actions to address the problem of shutdowns. How much time do I have? Okay. But I want to highlight again the importance of the work of civil society that has pushed forward, not only there, but also in other areas like strategic litigation, where we have seen various court cases ending with successful outcomes. And finally, a point we make in the report is we need to link the development agendas and the discussion on shutdowns in a far more sustainable way. So far, we see that there is development assistance for infrastructure projects going into various countries. We counted that at least 8 countries receiving World Bank support for connectivity expansion have implemented shutdowns, like this absurd outcome that infrastructure is being financed, but they're not used selectively. And this is reflected in how data is being collected too. Lots of what's happening in terms of measuring connectivity doesn't really take into account the occurrence of shutdowns. There's some movement with the new term of relatively new term of meaningful connectivity, but even there, I haven't seen an explicit consideration of shutdowns, but even partly disclaimers that shutdowns as political decisions shouldn't be included in the measurement of connectivity, to which I would respond, what is not a political decision? I leave it at that and look forward to our discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Tim, for starting the conversation on internet shutdowns and actually pointing out that there is progress, at least as a UN system-wide, to address this issue. So we'll continue with the discussion on internet shutdowns with Felicia. Anthonio, welcome. Felicia works with Access Now as campaigner for the Keep It On campaign, a global campaign that fights against internet shutdowns. The Keep It On coalition is made up of over 210 organizations across the world. Before joining Access Now, Felicia was a program associate at the Media Foundation for West Africa, and she coordinated the Africa Freedom of Expression Exchange, a continental network of free expression organizations in Africa. Felicia is also a 2019 fellow of the African Internet Governance School. She holds a master's degree in Lettres Language and Affairs International from the University of Orleans in France, and holds a BA degree in French and psychology from the University of Ghana. Felicia, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here to discuss an important issue. I don't know how many of you have experienced an internet shutdown before in the room, but it's a great pleasure that this is part of the agenda for this event. So what Keep It On means or stands for is that we came together in 2016 as civil society organizations to push back against internet shutdowns. And so the coalition was formed in 2016. And then since then, we've used diverse strategies to push back against internet shutdowns. So currently we have over 280 organizations, civil society organizations around the world. And Access Now hosts the coalition. When we launched Keep It On, it was in response to the growing threat of internet shutdowns around the world. So you remember the Arab Spring when Egypt shut down the internet in order to call protests. And so such incidents led to civil society coming together to have a stronger voice. And we started the Keep It On coalition. Since then, we've diligently documented internet shutdowns. We've advocated against them, raised awareness around internet shutdowns. And as Tim mentioned, the UN, for instance, has used our data in the last report that was published, highlighting the impact of internet shutdowns and what states can do to stop imposing them. Since 2016 till 2021, we've documented over 900 incidents of shutdowns. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, you all remember we were under lockdowns and we were all being urged to work from home. And so this means that most of us relied on the internet to be able to do our work. But then in some countries, over 29 countries in the world, we documented 159 shutdowns during the pandemic. And so just imagine where these shutdowns were happening, what options did people have? We've just seen that there's a gap in connectivity. And so those that struggle to come online are also denied access to the internet by their own governments, as we've observed. As the pandemic was, or we're getting out of the pandemic. We documented 182 internet shutdowns last year. And so it means that we are going back to the pre-pandemic era. In 2019, we documented over 213 shutdowns. And the sad thing is that these shutdowns are usually imposed to silence populations. And our monitoring has also shown that a lot of human rights violations happen when the internet is shut down. And so it enables governments to cover up these violations because journalists, human rights defenders would not be able to access the space in order to report these violations that are happening. Over the years, we've used strategic litigation, as was mentioned. And so, for instance, last year, we saw civil society in Zambia taking the government to court when they shut down the internet during elections. And the court ruled in favor of civil society and ordered the internet shutdown to be stopped, which was a great achievement for the community against internet shutdowns. Nigeria, we saw 7 months of social media blocking, that is Twitter. So Twitter was shut down for 7 months in Nigeria. And the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African State Community Courts, did pass judgment to condemn the internet shutdown as a violation of human rights or freedom of expression of the people in Nigeria. So these are some of the ways that we are pushing back. We continue to engage with various actors to ensure that internet shutdowns or people or governments that impose these shutdowns are brought to account. And I think it's a collective effort. Civil society cannot do it alone. And so we worked with regional and international bodies, including companies and other stakeholders, to bring this campaign or this issue to the limelight and to show how important this is for all of us to work towards achieving a free space for everyone to have access to the internet and to be able to use it for their daily activities. And so I think that it's great to have all of you here. It's great to see a lot of support from the academia. For instance, we need a lot of research to be done to understand some of the issues that are coming up when it comes to internet shutdowns. How is internet shutdown affecting women and girls? We still have the gender digital divide. And so how can we leverage such research to use that as advocacy? And civil society, we need the academia in that regard. And I would keep quiet now and then hand over to the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Felicia, and on your successful Keep It On campaign. I think your examples of Zambia and Nigeria are very inspiring. I don't know if there are other examples like that from other parts of the world. And thanks for pointing out the gender divide. I think we need to disaggregate the impacts, and that's a very important step. So our final speaker is Florence Simbiri-Jaoko, to my extreme right. Florence is a Kenyan lawyer trained at the University of Nairobi and the University of Bristol, advocate of the High Court of Kenya, currently lecturer at the University of Nairobi School of Law, and also the Special Envoy for the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, GHRP, member also of the International Commission of Jurists of Kenya, and previously was the chairperson of the Kenyan National Human Rights Commission from 2007 to 2012. Florence has worked as a judicial officer in Kenya for over 50 years and serves on various government task forces. And she's a trainer in legal, judicial, and human rights with extensive experience nationally, regionally, and globally. And Florence is also an advisory board member of the Geneva Human Rights Platforms. Florence, please.
Thank you, Miloon. So I'm just going to give a little presentation, but let me just say that first, of course, I'm very happy to be here. And especially during the morning, it was very interesting to hear about the developments in terms of, the platforms that exist for collecting data, analyzing it, and making it easy for citizens to be able to interact with information on human rights. So, and ours is to discuss the disruptions, and there's already been said, most of the internet disruptions actually occur in Africa and I think in Asia. And clearly, this is because of the power that the internet offers citizens individually or corporately to mobilize for action against the state, against corporates, against powerful individuals. And I think that that kind of scrutiny is usually not welcome by the state. And from Africa, actually, clearly, most of the disruptions have been during elections and also to prevent or preempt, action such as protests, which obviously are rights protected in most constitutions, I believe, even in Africa. And so when we look at these things, I think that in terms of these disruptions, it's interesting that on the one hand, a lot of these states are very quick to say how they want to be digitalized. They want to, they are embracing change, and they get a lot of funding from, donors, from support, even from private sector, because they are really on the go. But on the other hand, they want to restrict citizens' access to the very things that they are saying they are concerned about. So they have policies about free Wi-Fi, about all manner of things. But when they are threatened in terms of the oppressive actions that they take, then they use the greatest power that they have, which is that they can be able to shut down the platforms that citizens need. And as has already been said, these disruptions obviously interfere with the basic rights of information, freedom of information access, and and also freedom of association, because people do associate on these platforms. And they then have, unfortunately, the impact that they have on economic and social rights is so disruptive. And sometimes maybe in terms of even the recommendations is, other than the direct right that is interrupted, so the right to freedom of information, the right to education, because a lot of people actually derive resources from the internet. They also interact over different internet platforms just for education or pure education. Then there are health services, even in the third world, that actually rely on the internet. So you can be able to search for information about medicals, information, search for doctors. There are doctors who actually provide services online, and that is disrupted when you have these kind of disruptions. So when you think about the people who suffer those impacts, then it goes beyond. And then, of course, economic. And I think that I come from Kenya, and in Kenya, we were one of the first countries to develop what is called mobile money. And mobile money is now a big thing, I think, in Africa. It means that if there's disruption, there are people who actually cannot transact. So they are not able to do basic business. And these are usually, the bottom level business persons, small enterprises that cannot afford to have big, institutional setups. So when that is disrupted, there's so much impact that these disruptions bring. Now, with regard to the legal frameworks, I know that we've had this discussion earlier on about, should we have a new framework? How do we deal with this? And I think that at the UN level, so we have the resolution 47 that was directly discussing this. And I think that is a good initiative, because obviously, even if you cannot have, you can't have a new treaty or a new convention, but you can have a resolution that you can try to hold the states accountable. Then there are the rights that already exist. And I think it's a question of how do we unpack them in line with the new realities that we are facing, so that we also let these rights have a life, expand them, as opposed to always looking at them maybe from a very limited perspective. Is it possible to look at these rights in a more broad way, in a more visionary way, imaginative way, so that the frameworks that we have actually continue to serve the purposes that were intended for? And I think that what has been said about, for example, Nigeria and the court, and Zambia and the court decision, there's also a decision from Togo where they shut down the internet, and Amnesty Togo went to court, and that was the ECOWAS court. And this is a regional body. It actually ordered for compensation. It ordered Togo to come up with a legal framework to address freedom of expression. And as I looked at that, I thought that actually a lot of countries will still rely on, the international legal framework. So they will rely on the convention, they will rely maybe on the constitution of their country, but have they actually broken this down in statute, in policy, in administrative frameworks that go down to the root of how the executive actually executes its mandate and how the parameters are then defined? So I think those are areas that maybe we can be able to ask ourselves, is it possible? And then lastly, because I'm the only person now who is associated with NHRIs, I can see my colleagues are sitting on the other side. I think that NHRIs, in addition to civil society, are very, very critical. And they are critical because from the point when legislation, policy, administrative measures are being considered, they have the possibility to advise, to review, to be able to say this is not in compliance. And they don't do this alone. They do this with civil society. They can do this with private sector, because some of these things, it's not government. Government orders the private sector to shut down, or government orders independent telecommunication bodies established by government that are supposed to be independent. And actually, the African Commission, in its guideline on freedom of expression, clearly says that those bodies must be independent from interference by anyone, whether private sector, politics, they are supposed to be independent. So looking at that from the inception, what is, how does the NHRI then ensure that at that national level, they're actually able to do that advice? And of course, investigations, to investigate, and then they need to be empowered to have the capacity, because I think this is a very new and evolving area for, NHRIs that are underfunded, that don't have capacity, and maybe have been working in a traditional way of reporting human rights violations or investigations. So there's need to invest in that. And there's need to invest in the official, mandate holder, which is the judiciary, to provide remedies. Do our judiciaries actually understand what we are discussing here? When they are presented with these cases, do they have the capacity to understand the serious implications of not just disruptions, but the things we've been talking about earlier, that the state is intending to have these wide-reaching laws that give them so much power over us as individuals? So then also, I think NHRIs have a role to play in their education, advocacy, to work with the judiciaries. And obviously, finally, for them in their reporting, to link the national happenings to the regional mechanisms and to the international mechanisms, and then provide a more holistic approach of what is going on from the national level to the regional, and then at the international level, what steps can be taken that can actually transform the way that the mechanisms that we have right now can be used to address what concerns the citizens most. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Florence, for pointing out the power that the internet has assumed, and also it's a very important point that when do disruptions happen? You pointed out elections; it's a very common time, but I think we need to look at what are the other factors that lead to internet shutdowns, and also your point on the range of human rights that are impacted, and the important role that NHRIs play and can play in this issue. I just wanted to ask a question to the panelists. Give you 2 minutes each to respond, and then we'll go for questions to the audience and online. What should be the role of international organizations, companies, and civil society to ensure universal internet access? What more can these different actors do? So let me start off with Santiago.
Well, thank you very much. Considering this question, this is a very wide question, but regarding internet access, I believe that the current existing framework that might be applicable is the responsibility that private organizations have inside their own markets. For example, the guiding principles of business and human rights should be applicable, but still, it's a very complex question when we are making an analysis of the behavior of businesses that may find themselves under the pressure of governments for shutdowns. So that's a very difficult situation for businesses. But from the other perspective, without considering digital disruptions, intentional disruptions, I believe that the businesses are always interested in growing inside their own markets, and actually, it does not always depend on them to grow to those communities that are far away, affected by digital gap, maybe in rural areas, where it's actually the area where the digital gap is much more, let's say, much more significant. So first of all, regarding the coverage of digital gap, in cooperation with governments, I believe that the businesses should consider the possibility of having maybe not only a growth strategy, but also an affordable prices for people who live in poverty or extreme poverty, who are actually the main excluded people who don't have access to the internet, and without it, they cannot fully enjoy their human rights, as well as some of the colleagues here mentioned. So I believe that businesses by themselves, they can't make actually the change, but I believe that there should be an alliance with states that could facilitate the growth of infrastructure, regulations, or even some other public policies that can be useful here.
Yeah, thank you. I already gave a few answers before. On the role of, say, our organization, I see multiple facets here. One is in collaboration with other partners, monitoring and data collection and raising visibility of the issue. That is linked to the data collection and the definition of shutdown issue. Reaching out really to development actors to raise the awareness there, to advocate for better integration of human rights due diligence processes there, to take into account the risk of shutdowns, maybe to raise the issue in funding agreements, etc. That would be one avenue. Sustained advocacy in the area, for sure. Dialogue with governments, technical assistance when it comes to legal frameworks, for example. Just to clarify, I believe and we believe that almost always resorting to shutdowns will be the wrong answer. It's been shown many times it increases tensions, it doesn't address the issue, and it has the enormous effects on people's lives, on economy, on health, on you name it. But if they happen, then there needs to be far more transparency, there needs to be accountability, access to remedies, etc. So if it happens in secrecy on the basis of non-existent or century-old laws that are not fit for purpose, then it's actually even worse. Another thought is supporting circumvention and prevention strategies, raising literacy in the use of circumvention tools can be another strategy that can help. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I hope I have points to add on. Okay, so I do agree with all the points that have been raised. And I think that we've come a very long way, and there are so many efforts with regards to connecting the unconnected, the UN Secretary General's roadmap. So I think that what is important is we do have the laws, we do have resolutions, we do have treaties that states have signed onto. And so how do we ensure that they are implementing what they've signed onto? As Tim indicated, can we tie, for instance, internet shutdowns as a human rights indicator? When governments are going for funds, how can we get them to commit to keeping internet access? As Florence mentioned, they do go for support to expand investment in digital or digitalization, but at the same time, they go against these commitments by shutting down the internet, and it waters down all these efforts that are being made to connect more people. And what we haven't seen an incident where an internet shutdown has resolved any crisis. If anything, it's just worsening situations. It puts people in danger. It doesn't happen on a normal day, like as we are sitting here, nothing is happening. The government will not shut down the internet. They will only shut down the internet when there's elections coming up, when there is protests against a bad policy, as we saw in Iran. And the sad thing is that as people mobilize to contest whatever has happened in a particular country, you actually see how governments amplify internet shutdowns. So in Iran, protests started in one city, and as the protests were spreading across, the government was shutting down the internet. So it covered all the areas that the internet, the protests were happening. So clearly it is government's way of controlling citizens. They want to control the narrative. They want to prevent the rest of the world from seeing what is happening. And every time there's such a shutdown, the result is terrible. We see people being killed, people being injured, and all that. And so I think we have to hold governments accountable. We've used litigation, but then how can we pinch them where it hurts most. So if you've shut down the internet, what amount of the funding or whatever support you are requesting for should be deducted, noting that there are citizens that rely on these funding that governments receive for their personal growth and development. And so how do we ensure that governments are punished for these acts, but then citizens don't suffer for the inactions of their own governments? And then, of course, awareness raising is something we cannot stop talking about. We do have a project under the Keep It On campaign called the Shutdown Impact Stories. And when you read the stories that people share about how shutdowns have impacted them, it cuts across a wide range of beyond human rights. For instance, you travel to a different country, you don't know anywhere, you rely on your Google map. I'm sure most of us used our Google Maps to get here. So just imagine you got in and the internet was shut down. Even sometimes when there's no shutdown and maybe you are on a roaming SIM card and then it's not working, you just get frustrated to find your way around. And so these are the ways that internet shutdowns affects us. And we cannot detach it from people's daily lives. People use the internet to do their research, to apply for scholarships, for funding, for business opportunities and all that. And so once you intentionally deny them access to these rights, you shouldn't be allowed, like you should be held accountable. We've had shutdowns that have prolonged. Just imagine the internet being shut down for one day. I'm sure it's unimaginable for most of you, but there are places where the internet has been shut down since 2020. And this is a conflict. There's a conflict happening in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The internet has been shut down. So you can just imagine the psychological effect it's having on people even outside of the country. They don't know if their families are doing okay. How do I check up on my families? We've had stories about people talking about how they cannot even send money to their families because the banking system is down. It relies on the internet. Salaries would not be we cannot just transfer salaries. You have to maybe put it on the table, going back to the Stone Age, so people come to pick it up. It just disrupts a lot of aspects of our lives. And so I think we all have a collective responsibility, as I already said. Companies have a role to play. Yes, they operate on licenses in various countries, but they also have responsibilities under the UN guidelines for businesses to also uphold fundamental human rights. And so when you receive an order to shut down the internet, I think you shouldn't just make it so easy for governments and just shut it down because you are protecting your license. How about you question, how long are we shutting down the internet? We are going to make this public to the community to know that you are the one imposing the shutdown, because some governments don't want it to be public that they are the ones that are ordering internet shutdowns, and that waters down the transparency efforts that we want to see when internet shutdowns happen.
Okay, I think one way is to reduce the costs, because I think a lot of governments really have high costs for telephony and those sorts of things. So that also means that just financially, it's not accessible to most people. So I think most governments should consider that as a way of encouraging more people to get online or to be able to use these facilities. The other thing is for there to be better training and awareness creation, because I think the population, there are some people who are afraid of using, the internet because they don't understand how it works, but also because of the things we were talking about earlier today, that it's not secure for them, and information is gathered from them, which they don't know how it is used, where it is used, who is having control over these things. So I think what I'm saying is that there should be some confidence building by the state in terms of the security of the internet. so that people can use it without feeling exposed or without feeling that information from them might be used for purposes other than whatever they were initially done for. And just a fun thing, I'm from Kenya, and in Kenya we have very serious Kenyans called Kenyans on Twitter, and we are never shut down. And Kenyans on Twitter, when Uganda is shut down, they are the ones tweeting about the opposition in Uganda and how they are being treated, and somehow they can get photos, they get everything, and they post it online. So it's very interesting that Uganda shuts down, but they have this neighbor that does not shut down, and the neighbor's citizens decide that it is their duty to tell the world what is going on in Uganda. So it's a very interesting thing, and at least from my perspective, that we've never really had a shutdown. So, but the way that they use the internet, even responsibly in that way, is amazing, because nobody mobilizes them, but they think that it's important to tell the world what is going on.
It's a great example. Maybe we can get them to take on other countries as well. So I want to go to the floor for questions or online. I'd request you to, if you're addressing one of our panelists, please take their name. Otherwise, you can just ask a general question. And please keep your comments brief. So who would like to questions from the floor? Otherwise, we can also go online. Stefania, yes, please.
But I don't understand it. Can you hear me well now? So thank you very much for this this panel. And I have a question that it's probably coming from the fact that I don't know enough about internet shutdowns and how they work, but I wanted to make a link as well with the topic of the previous panel. And I wanted to ask, I mean, it's a general question, I don't know if anyone can actually respond. To what extent the issue of, bridging the digital gap and giving access to the internet is actually being used as a entry point for surveillance and for feeding into surveillance capitalism. So, I mean, I know that also private companies have granted access to the internet in some countries. So I'm wondering to what extent this kind of projects are actually, yes, of course, they look as if we're granting access to the internet and so, promoting human rights, but at the same time, they're also collecting data and we don't know how this data is used. And so to what extent this narrative is actually being fed into or used, and is there anything that can be done? And I suppose that maybe the answer would go back to the new digital rights that we spoke about earlier. But yes, that's my question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll take a series of questions. Felix?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for your excellent interventions. Actually, there is one area that you just in the very end round touched upon, which was the business responsibility, which was something that we addressed much more in the previous panel. But I'm wondering, to get back to, I think, what you, Felicia, said about the role of companies in internet shutdowns, just accepting the request for shutdown, or actually what's the leverage for big companies, what's the leverage for network providers, maybe also to counter or to limit those shutdowns. So there the role of the business would be a question. And the other one also that goes maybe more to the part also touched upon by Santiago, when network providers enter a new market, a new country, aren't there also certain steps that could be looked at in terms of serving poor communities where it might be less profitable, but in opening that market, whether there are steps? And finally, if I may also a question that might go your way, because it's related also to the digital gap much more than to disruptions. Sometimes when we speak about e-rights or right to connectivity, or actually now the right to be deconnected, there's also criticism that we talk about rights for the rich. So where would you see also there, for example, link with SDG 17, the global partnership, in really bringing about more the equity questions in those discussions? Because I think also when we think at the earlier discussions on digital issues in the Human Rights Council, I remember very vividly, we had a room mostly then filled with European or Northern diplomats actually who felt much more concerned about that topic. I think it's changing now, but just your take on that. Thank you.
Okay, we take one more question. In the back there.
Hello, I'm Paba Pieratna. I'm a master's student at the Graduate Institute. This is a general question.
Sorry. There's a issue with the volume. Could you speak up a little?
Is it? Okay, sorry. I'm a master's student at the Graduate Institute, and this is a general question. It was said that before bans are per se disproportionate, complete ban, sort of like internet shutdowns are per se disproportionate. And all the examples that were discussed were directly in violation of rights such as freedom of expression and mobilization, all of that. But I'm from Sri Lanka, and we had a situation where right after a terrorist attack that specifically targeted a specific religious group in the country, there was an internet shutdown, and it was prima facie justified because it said that, you know, there will be incitement. The people belonging to the other religion might try to sort of retaliate, and there will be violence. So there was a prima facie justification for that that shutdown. So how do we address situations like that? Basically, like if you have a yardstick to assess government regulations, how do we conceptualize it to capture these sort of prima facie legitimate regulations and say that, you know, even in that instance, it's wrong, or how do we get a compromise?
Okay, thanks very much. So we'll go back to the panelists. We start with Santiago. There was a specific question for you, and then we'll go back.
Yes, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to say I have a slight hearing impairment, so I will kindly ask Felix to repeat the question. My apologies.
Sorry if the microphones are also set too low here. It was about the digital gap. Two questions, like the potential to request network providers when entering a new market to also serve poorer communities, so also in the expansion of connectivity. And the other one, whether actually discussing e-rights was a discussion for the rich, as long as that connectivity is not given, and whether a stronger link to the SDGs can also be of help there.
Okay, regarding the first question, what examples of good practices that we can have here is, first of all, we can have the passive market interaction, or we can have an intervention from the state. So in the first scenario, where it's only free market, normally what happens is that when there is a high level of competitivity, there is an expansion, try to cover more and more areas. And for example, in my country, in what happened is we got very saturated of mobile services. And what happened is that at first the government was asking for a fee for every call from one operator to the other, and also there were fees for internet services. What happened is that the companies came together and said, because of these fees that you are asking to pay, there are many people who can't pay the extra costs. So the companies tried to go as low as possible, and then they pressed on the government, and the government withdrew these interconnection costs and taxes to internet connectivity. Thanks to this, the prices went down, and the profits started to come up. And then there was a rush for trying to covering the country. Actually, in Paraguay at this moment, around 84% of the population has access to the internet, whether it is home internet or by mobile phone. And most of them are actually mobile phones, because the moment when the government reduced these taxes and eliminated the interconnectivity cost from one operator to the other, they started all to buy phones, and this happened around 12 years ago. So this is an example. On the other hand, we can have a specific regulation about prices. I am not very fond of low prices regulations, because this can distort the market and then have a negative impact in the long term. So there should be a study for each context, but this could be a short-term strategy that at some point should be afterwards led for the markets, that when we have a lot of competition, we should try to bring competitive businesses. And normally competitions, well, they normally tend to bring the price down, but it should be a clean competition, not the competition of the oligopolies, where the effects that these alliances could have. So stepping in avoiding these kind of alliances that can make artificial prices stay up, that could also be another measure that states can take into this regard. This is just our examples. We have more, but because of time constraints, I'm going to focus on this. And there was another question that I want to take the answer is about the examples of Sri Lanka, where there was a justification, an attempt of justification for a disruption. Actually, what happens is normally exactly the opposite. First, sometimes disruptions are here to limit the impact, the mediatic impact of certain certain events. But in every country around the world, for example, in spite of the disruption we have seen in Iran, everybody knows what's happening over there, because the world is already globalized. We're not living in the globalization. We are already globalized. So I live in Paraguay on the other side of the world, and I knew, in real time what was happening in Iran in spite of the shutdown. So that justification is not useful for the purposes that sometimes come in. Also, regarding unrest, there's another problem, because people who live inside this area of conflict, if you bring disruptions, that could be a worsener of the situation, and even contribute to even worse justified violence, or even political violence. Sometimes you can actually start going in the line of what is actually state terrorism, because it's actually an act of political violence from the state, the disruption of policy. And the most commonly known definition of terrorism is political violence. And this is a form of political violence, but coming from the state. So if you're generating more violence, the more unrest you will have. So, there are other consequences, as other of our panelists told. For example, that psychological impact. And if I want to know if my friends are okay, I don't have friends in Iran, for example, or Sri Lanka at this moment, but I will. I know, and at some point. But if someone is living in that situation, I'll be maybe through Facebook. I will contact her, or maybe they will contact me and tell me, "Hey, this is happening here." Or even the example of Kenya and Rwanda was great, because this tells us that we already live in a globalized world, and it doesn't matter if you disrupt the signal or not, it will come over still. So everybody will know. But I just wanted to leave this reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Santiago. Although I don't think we know everything that's happening in Iran. You know, it's very selective what we hear. So there were two sets of questions that go back to the panelists. One is whether bridging the digital gap increases surveillance and impacts on privacy, and then the one Santiago already addressed about what if there are legitimate justifications for shutdown. So who wants to go?
There are no legitimate justifications for shutdowns. I think what we've seen is that in places where internet shutdowns are rampant, India, for instance, is the major perpetrator of shutdowns. Last year, we documented over 106 incidents. And for the past 4 years, we've always had India topping the shame list, as we call it. And you get people that have experienced shutdowns for so long, trying to believe that maybe the government is right. And then you have those that share the impact that it's had on them. And you can clearly see that the impact it has outweighs the so-called reasons governments give. And so, as Santiago said, when you shut down the internet during violence, I'm caught up in, maybe I'm from work and I'm going home. I don't know where to pass. I don't know which safe route to take to get home. And then you are endangering my life. You're not you're not improving my life in any way. You're rather putting me in danger. And that is when people get agitated, and then it increases more violence rather than resolving any or reducing public safety and order, as authorities normally say. And then when you say national security, what does national security mean? When the individuals in the country are being endangered. And so there's no justification for internet shutdowns. That is what I would say. With regards to if increased digitalization is also more like resulting in digital violations or surveillance, or I think the answer is that it depends on people's interests. And that is why everyone in this room, stakeholders, must ensure that in as much as we are expanding digitalization, it doesn't mean because you are connecting people to the internet, you just provide them with any kind of service. They deserve quality access to the internet. And that doesn't mean you have the leverage to be collecting their data and surveilling them. And we've seen the Pegasus situation that has happened. And thanks to journalists, civil society, all these violations were unraveled, and we are holding such companies accountable. And so we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of work to protect people that are left when it comes to getting connected. And even those of us that are connected, we still have the responsibility to make sure that our rights are not violated. Because when you look at internet connections, in most parts of the world, we all pay for it. Like, we pay to access the service. And so we deserve to have access to quality service when it comes to internet access. And I think, yeah, those are the main questions. I didn't.
What about when internet is shut down to stop people on social media inciting violence? This happened a couple of times in India, and violence was stopped. Now, that can be extended, but what about that?
I think the flip side is, what if the internet was not shut down? We wouldn't know. We don't know if it's because the internet was shut down that the violence was stopped. What we know is that misinformation, for instance, when people are going to the polls and then government shuts down the internet claiming to prevent misinformation, it rather amplifies the misinformation because people don't have avenues to verify the information that is already out there.
And so that also doesn't work. So maybe I think it's the same for violence online. Yes, we can work with companies to take down content that is insightful, and that is when we need private, the tech companies and social media companies to act as quick as possible and effectively, rather than leaving the work to civil society to detect and then taking several days and hours to be able to take down such content. So maybe there are alternatives for us to resolve this rather than completely cutting people off the internet.
More global standards or rules.
Okay, so for me, I think I just want to say that with regard to privacy, because I think that's very important, and especially for countries in Africa, where you find that government is collecting data from people, so your biometrics, some of this face recognition by different companies. So it's not even, you even as a citizen, you have no idea who is this company. So one arm of government has contracted this foreign company, another one contracted another foreign company, and there are legal requirements for you to give this information to the government. And I think for me, that is very worrying that some of these states that are engaged in these exercises don't even have the capacity to be gathering the information themselves. They are contracting the gathering of information to foreigners who then store this information, and there's no indication on what that information is going to be used for. So I think that is why actually at the national levels, we must be able to break down this idea of privacy, the protection of a person's privacy. How does it happen at the national level? What participation has taken place before the state has decided that this information is actually critical? Because sometimes government being government, they want to gather anything and everything. And because they have the legal capacity to do that, then the citizen has no capacity to say that, no, you can only take this information and not this one. And the citizen does not have the capacity to ask, who are you as a company? Where are you taking my information? So I think that is why a proper legal framework is so important, because then it should outline what is the purpose? Who is this company? How long are they keeping your information for? So those are things that I think are very, very important for the citizen to be able to know what the government is doing together with its partners in private sector.
Thanks very much, Florence. I wanted to ask you, do we have time for another round on the internet? No, we don't have time. Yeah, I'm coming to you. Okay. We don't have. Okay. So sorry about that. I think maybe Domenico is writing down the questions and we'll, try to respond at some levels. Tim, you have the closing word.
Closing. Well, I wanted to expand on the question about providing access and surveillance, etc. It reminded me of something like years ago. I participated in a privacy bar camp with the Jan Philipp Albrecht. He was the rapporteur in the European Parliament for the GDPR. And he was asked why on earth he could possibly be on Facebook, given the data protection track record of the company. And he said, yeah, but you know what? That's exactly why we are doing that. I want to participate in life. I'm a politician. I have a choice. I need to be in public. I need to be able to engage with the world. Now I need to work on how to make this a space that's safe for everyone and not abusive and not exploitative. And so in the end, the question is like, you could say, well, we should not build more roads because then people could be killed by cars. But no, you need to just make the roads and the cars and safer, and you need to create space for pedestrians, etc. So it needs to go hand in hand. And so that would be my response to that question. I would also like to turn it on its head and link it again to shutdowns, because shutdowns, I see them as one tool in a toolbox of measures of control linked to authoritarian trends like censorship, criminalization of expression, surveillance, state-sponsored troll armies, online harassment. Like, these are tools that can be pulled out by a government and used for specific purposes to keep control of the information space. And I think that's very important to not to see shutdowns in isolation, but as part of a larger picture. And that leads me to the Sri Lanka related question, because it's actually a very hard one, and it's something I've grappled with a lot. As I said, we discourage shutdowns on any form based largely on the same considerations. There's very little evidence that they actually achieve the purpose, but very strong indications that they backfire, actually create information vacuums, that information black holes that enhance uncertainty, insecurity, etc. And as I said before, but and we need to face the reality, shutdowns happen, then at least we want to have certain minimum standards in place. And the first one is, it's clearly a very invasive restriction of rights. So there needs to be a legal basis. It needs to be based in law, in a clear, well-defined, publicly available law, extra for these purposes. This is a tricky thing, because at the same time, we don't want to encourage governments to really have a legal framework for something we think that shouldn't happen. So there's some paradox happening here. The burden would be on the government to show that that was strictly necessary and proportionate for the purpose. And that's a very, very heavy burden to me. The government itself shouldn't be the arbiter here and have the last decision-making power. There needs to be independent oversight and independent prior authorization. Transparency, I mentioned it before, I think it's huge in this context. So much happens without any information of the public. Everyone has to speculate what really is happening and why. So again, really bad. The Indian Supreme Court, I think, because we spoke about litigation, ordered some transparency measures in India. And remedy. There needs to be full access to the courts and to other remedial avenues for the people who are affected by such measures. And yeah, that's what I needed to say.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. So I just had one point, which is I don't know if there's data on where the disruptions in the internet shutdowns are taking place. Are these all in authoritarian countries? Is it also happening in democratic spaces? I think that would be an interesting issue to look at, because one of the questions that comes is, we can have global rules and we can have standards, but if the obligation is on states and the states themselves are responsible for these kind of things, how do we get across to them? I think it's just a question I want to leave us with. It's a problem we have with human rights in many issues related to security, but I just wanted to leave that question open. And I very much want to thank the panelists, all of you, for your great contribution, and thanks for all the questions. And we'll close here. Thank you.